Well, first, I just want to thank John Webley for inviting me to give the talk. This is really exciting to be a part of Yale's 18th and 19th century colloquium. So I guess I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen and getting things all set up here so that you can see the slides as I'm moving through. All right, that should be it, I hope. So this is Delacroix's Misogyny. On the 6th of February in 1828, the French painter Eugène Delacroix, then 29 years old, wrote a letter to his close friend Charles Soulier. In it, he described having finished a monumental canvas called The Death of Sardanapalus, a painting which would be admitted to the Salon of 1827 when it was first decided to prolong that exhibition in early 1828. The canvas, which you see here, was based largely on a recent play by Lord Byron, and it shows Sardanapalus, the last king of Assyria, icily observing the destruction of all that is most dear to him. In Delacroix's own words, as found in the second supplement to the catalogue of that salon, quote, "The rebels besiege him in his palace. Reclining on a superb bed at the summit of an immense pyre, Sardanapalus gives the order to his eunuchs and the palace officers to slaughter his women, his pages, even his horses and his favorite dogs, so that nothing that had survived his pleasure, that had served his pleasure might survive him," end quote. The total annihilation we see in the painting was not found in Byron's play. In fact, no known version of the tale includes this particular scene of carnage. But Delacroix had been at work on it for some 5 months. In September of 1827, he had described himself as up to his eyes in work, and by late November, he admitted that, quote, "I tremble at the thought of all I still have to do." He had high hopes for the canvas, and his letters from these months reveal flashes of confidence and excitement. Quote, "There are moments when I think of that damned painting of mine with some pleasure," end quote. Alas, the artist's hopes would come to be dashed. For in that same letter to Soulier, Delacroix described seeing the work hung in the salon for the first time. He expressed sincere concern, stating that, quote, "I thought it looked horrible when I stood in front of it." And he further characterized himself as dissatisfied and a quote unquote very worried man. His fears were soon justified. Critics largely panned the work. Etienne Jean Delacluse, a former pupil of Jacques-Louis David, called it, quote, "an error of the painter," while an anonymous writer for the Gazette de France proclaimed it the worst painting in the Salon. Other critics were more pointed in their condemnation. One writer called it a nightmare. Another wondered, quote, why the artist neglected to renounce his ugliness. And even Stendhal went so far as to observe the same quote unquote Satanism he had also found in Byron's play. Several critics further tied the painting directly to its maker and the passions which seemed to rule him. Delacluse noted the quote-unquote bizarre ideas he found in the picture, while a critic writing for the Moniteur Universel described how Sardanapalus had, quote, "become synonymous with all that is most ridiculous and vile about debauchery and cowardice." All this begs the question, what was it about the painting that caused such jousting in the critical arena? What made it an error, the worst, ugly, vile, debauched, and satanic? Is it these things? And if so, how did it come to be considered, as we will see, one of Delacroix's masterpieces, perhaps even one of the greatest paintings of the 19th century? Remember that even the artist had thought that it looked horrible and was a very worried man when he first released it into the public realm. So what was it about the canvas that made him so anxious? I'd like to spend the next 30 minutes or so making a case that it was, at least in part, Delacroix's view of women that made this painting so unacceptable in its own time. I'll build the case with several kinds of evidence. The painting itself, of course, and the preparatory studies the artist made for it. But then I'd like to weave these together in perhaps something of an old-fashioned art historical way with Delacroix's letters and his famous journal, splicing these with the reminiscences of his contemporaries and various kinds of allusions that art historians have made to the artist's misogyny in the century and a half since he died. Essentially, I think we should ask ourselves why this painting caused such fury, what we might have overlooked about it, and even more importantly, we should be asking ourselves, why does this not infuriate us anymore? Sorry, it's been a long semester of teaching. Excuse me. Most scholars seem to think it was purely the formal qualities of the painting, high-pitched color, loose brushwork, the unusual compositional scheme that led critics to such vituperations. But if you look at the picture's checkered history, you actually find that the problems Delacroix encountered with it went way beyond the usual histrionics and exceeded even just the journalistic realm. In fact, the superintendent of fine arts at the time, Sosthène de la Rochefoucauld, wrote a letter of protest about the painting to the director of royal museums, demanding that it be replaced by other works. Quote, "I consider it my duty not to encourage a manner whose imitation would be so dangerous," end quote. Would merely unusual painterly qualities lead someone like Rochefoucauld to describe imitation of it as quote unquote dangerous? Now, I'm not the only one to put this idea forward. A few scholars have hinted that it may have been more than just formal concerns that led the critics to such rhetorical extremes. Roy Howard Brown, way back in 1984, made perhaps the strongest case for the subject matter itself being the problem. He claimed, quote, "the painting's amorality, if not immorality, was too strong and undisguised for many of Delacroix's contemporaries," end quote. This notion of the work's amorality aligns well with Rochefoucauld's concern that sight of the painting might encourage a manner that would be, quote unquote, dangerous. Fascinatingly, Rochefoucauld took the matter even further when his request was not met with action. He invited the painter to one of his evening receptions to give him a proper dressing down. Delacroix, never one to lose confidence in himself for long, thought he was going to be praised, stating that he put on his, quote, "best coat and best white cravat," imagining the man was going to offer him the Legion of Honor, end quote. Sadly, for Delacroix, that was not the case. As reported to Soulier in a letter from late April of 1828, quote, "The gist of it was that I have no hope of anything from that government quarter so long as I don't change my ways." And you can see the French here, changer pas de route. The joke was carried even further when they read the list of works previously carried out for the Conseil d'État. There was no mention of my name, nor of what I had done, which proves that I shall have to change course, retourner d'autre façon. That same letter makes it clear, additionally, that Delacroix was definitely reading the criticism directed at his painting. Quote, "My most favorable critics are at one in considering me an interesting maniac, whom it would be rash to encourage in his errors and eccentricities," end quote. Again, I ask you, would purely formal concerns cause Delacroix to feel like he was considered en fou, a maniac? When Rochefoucauld took him aside to tell him he had to change his ways, was it only drawing, color, composition, and style that he had in mind? For me, what's partly so intriguing about all this is that Delacroix had essentially been through it before, when his massacre at Chios received extremely mixed reviews in 1824. This work, too, demonstrated the artist's interest in orientalizing themes, but instead of drawing on narratives from antiquity, Delacroix this time ripped his subject straight from the headlines. His Chios depicted an episode from the Greek War of Independence, which had only recently erupted in 1821. The raw material for the scene, famously characterized as the massacre of painting by the artist Antoine Jean Gros, was drawn from the decimation of the inhabitants of the island of Chios, which really occurred in April of 1822. A little over a year later, Delacroix committed to the project in his journal, and by December, he had the large canvas waiting in his studio. The jury had initially resisted accepting the work, and their concerns proved well-founded. Delacroix, again, that same critic who would assert that Sardanapalus was an error, proclaimed that the painter of Chios had a talent for making things ugly. Charles Paul Landon called it a marked system of ugliness, and the Davidian critic Pierre Athanase Chauvin cursed Delacroix, stating, quote, oops, sorry, I had these on the side and I forgot, quote, misfortune to the barbarous painter whose deregulated imagination gives birth only to hideous wounds, contortions, and agonies, and who seems to think he can never spill enough blood or cause enough casualties, end quote. As we've already seen, much of this rhetoric would come to be echoed in the wake of Sardanapalus. The accusations of ugliness and barbarism especially reverberated across the years. At this point, I can't help but wonder, is all of this discussion of the criticism helping us to see these paintings better? What is it that these two canvases share that is so ugly and barbaric? Let's begin with Chios, for it takes a moment to let all of the individual narratives in this painting work on you. Most of it is sheer anguish. Couples embracing tender, pathos-ridden farewells, crying and dying, and utter despondency. The mother, propped awkwardly on the ground on the right side, is particularly awful. In all of Western painting, I know of few details as tragic as this one. A child twisting and contorting to reach the breast of his mother, who is already passing into a state of decomposition. Note the awfulness of her swollen purple hand. Let me turn the brightness on my screen up. A fist which is set in rigor mortis in a kind of perpetual resistance as the child clutches breast tissue already marred by heavy blue vein lividity. Then, just above this, on the same right-hand side of that picture, there's an absolute explosion of sadistic energy. Almost all of the painting's action is contained in the cluster of bodies surrounding that rearing horse. There we see yet another nude Greek woman who is tethered to the back of the charger. It must be galloping furiously, for her hair, can you see, it's been thrown upwards in great waves of desperation as she struggles urgently to loosen the rope wound tightly twice across her arm. She's managed to slip her thumb into the knot. You can just see it. Just as a Greek man makes this valiant attempt to pull her captor from his horse. Unfazed, though, the Turk is already unsheathing his blade. In another moment, the Greek hero will be cut down, and the woman, if she survives being dragged across the rocky landscape, will be repeatedly raped by Turkish forces before being sold into slavery. Several scholars have noted a connection between this horse and the stallion in the foreground of Sardanapalus. Both have eyes that bulge in terror at the scenes unfolding before them. Yet where the earlier painting contained and bracketed off most of its dreadful elements, the later work is an orgy of cruelty and chaos, filled to the brim with bodies writhing in terror and pain. Under these circumstances, the horse in Chios has been transformed in Sardanapalus. It rears backwards wildly as a palace guard pulls ferociously on its reins, a dagger just piercing the equine flesh below. That stabbing finds its echo to the right, where a nude woman twists in surrendering agony as the palace officer who grabs her stabs her to death. I looked at this painting for years without ever realizing quite how gruesome that foreground pair really is. For if you measure the officer's sheath against the blade that he holds in his hand, it becomes painfully clear how deep that blade actually is in her chest. And I've just drawn an arrow to give you a sense of the scale, and then copied and pasted it above to show you this thing that I just never realized. Delacroix gave us these details so that we could make such visual extrapolations. And he rewards our long looking further by including decorative embellishments that act as graphic metaphors for the sprays of blood that would result from such gruesome wounds. The cobalt blue fabric that bursts arbitrarily from behind her chest and cascades around her body substitutes for the torrent of blood that would pour from such a wound. A similar effect characterizes the area where the blade is piercing the horse. It might come as something of a shock to hear how art historians have explained this painting. In 1963, René Wieg, a prominent curator in the Louvre's Department of Paintings, described it like this, quote, "One could almost smell the heady perfumes of it, mingled with the smell of blood rising in heavy curling puffs, like the smoke from the fire that is just taking hold. There's the body of the woman, with its curves as lissom as her wavy hair, and its flesh as bright as a fruit made of light itself." Now, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time enjoying the perfume smell of blood, and that woman being slaughtered in the foreground doesn't remind me of fruit. Further, consider Jack Spector, who wrote an entire book on the painting in 1974. While he's describing that same woman that made Wieg think of delicious fruit, Spector stays focused on the jewels and other accessories she wears. It makes him think of how Francois Boucher handled pearls, and he puts forward this comparison on the page. In that same book, Spector makes an important admission, though, noting that some spectators have found the Sardanapalus painting, quote unquote, unpalatable. He then goes on to use the word squeamish, however, to describe anyone who finds it, quote, hard to take the sadistic behavior unleashed in an erotic context, end quote. Such labeling essentially infantilizes anyone who finds the violence in the work disturbing, as though such an estimation was beneath the dignity of the rigorous and objective, read male historian. Now, wait a minute, wait. You might be thinking, these are very dated pieces of scholarship. Times have changed. We don't write like that anymore. I offer, then, the preeminent T.J. Clark, one of the most important and respected art historians working today. This is Clark, who, I should admit, is an absolute hero of mine in late 2019. Quote, "Sex and violence," Sardanapalus says, "are completely and necessarily entangled. Sex is antagonism, though of course it is reciprocity too. Passion is danger, love and hate are eternal partners in it. Intensity in human life, and sex is intensity, is always the near neighbor of horror. Dominance and submission are indelibly part of it. Sex is aggression. A caress is always a blow," end quote. Let me be clear here, really clear. These are men whose work I read voraciously, whose writing I teach. I respect them. And if I'm being totally honest, they inspire me. But when I read passages like these, I wonder, how could they have gotten it so wrong? How could they have missed seeing Delacroix for what he is? When I look at the death of Sardanapalus, I don't see fruit or marvel at the handling of the jewelry. I don't look at it and think about the joys of aggressive sex. To me, the whole painting seems to heave and hemorrhage as endless echoes of violence reverberate across the canvas. My eyes travel around the painting and they lock in on yet another woman, this time in the background, who appears to have been pushed against the far left side of the bed. Her arm has always looked broken to me, misshapen like a lamb shank. It flails uselessly as the eunuch before her draws his massive blade. Then nearby, It's difficult to make out, but behind them, a woman looks as though she has just hung herself from the rafters. She struggles gruesomely, her arms continuing to clutch the fabric above her horribly broken neck. This area of the painting, in all its recessive murkiness, resonates in my mind with an area of the Chios that is equally indistinct. In the middle ground of that painting, behind the embracing couple, a tangled jumble of brutality is unfolding. Most scholars never even mention the action contained there, and indeed, it is difficult to decipher the melee in reproductions, but in person, that combat is clear. Turkish fighters are taking hostages. Several women have been thrown to the ground, and one is being grabbed nauseatingly by her hair as she holds a small naked child aloft. I ask you now, does it make more sense why critics found these works so ugly and barbaric? Why Rochefoucauld thought Delacroix's manner was dangerous and should not be imitated? In many ways, I think we can see an escalation occurring in the artist's work. From 1824 to 1827, his deregulated imagination, as Chauvin called it, had indeed given birth to increasingly disturbing nightmares. And really, even Delacroix's earliest salon success, the 1822 Bark of Dante, had already contained a strong sign of the painter's interest in violence directed specifically at women. Most scholars focus their attention on the sources Delacroix may have used in composing this painting. Michelangelo and Rubens are foremost among them. But what they miss in sourcing all this iconography is the terrifying spasm of abuse in the center foreground, a woman being savagely kicked in her stomach by the man to her left. She contorts in pain, her mouth opening much like that of the deceased mother in the foreground of Chios. Scholars have also largely failed to note Delacroix's obsession with rendering this motif. The artist repeatedly sketched the kicking figure, translating the motion with subtle variations to the angles of the leg. Likewise, numerous sketches attest to his interest in the reaction of the female figure to this kick itself. She looks variously angered or anguished as her body recoils from the force. Studies for the Sardanapalus reveal similar violent fixations and interests. Delacroix covered page after page with sketches of the perpetrators that would fill the final painting. He seemed particularly interested in the body of the woman who would come to be stabbed in the foreground. Some studies, like this one, are obviously just observations of his model's body. He's testing out different angles, seeing how the twist of her hips looks in profile versus from behind. But as he comes closer to how that body will look in the final painting, more of the reaction to the stabbing itself works its way into the sketches. In this pencil and sepia study, the model's head has begun to coil and rear backwards. Her shoulders move harshly upwards in reaction, while her left arm dangles lifelessly. Delacroix also tried out a more dramatic pose for this figure, one that had the woman reaching desperately over her head. But then a pastel from 1827 shows him arriving at the final configuration. The model's legs buckle beneath her, causing a rotation that allows us to see both the fullness of her buttocks and most of her left breast at the same time. Other sketches for the work reveal that the horse being stabbed in the foreground and the woman about to be murdered in the background were compositional elements long grounding the picture. That cluster of figures to the right of the bed was of particular interest, though, and Delacroix seems to have tried out different possibilities for the hanging, envisioning the woman perhaps being choked on the bed. As is evident from this, I'll admit it's difficult to see pencil sketch. A small oil study the artist made in 1827 shows the extremes to which this scene was taken in Delacroix's imagination. In it, the woman staring painfully out of the final painting from the foot of the bed has been completely decapitated. Her body is little more than a haphazard mound of flesh. The woman next to her will likely lose her head. Oh, sorry, I meant to be indicating these. The woman next to her will likely also lose her head, given the savagery of the blow the officer has just dealt. You might be surprised to hear that the oil sketch was actually more often exhibited in the 19th century than the large version Delacroix showed in the Salon. That painting went unsold for years and was shown only once more in the artist's lifetime, just before his death, in one of the newly emerging private galleries. Before he sold it in 1844, though, Delacroix made yet another small copy of the canvas so that he might always have a version in his studio. All of this makes me wonder, how was it that this painting came to be permanently on view, along with the Chios and the bark of Dante, in one of the most hallowed halls of the Louvre, where some 10 million people see them every year? How did these works come to be the ones we teach undergraduates to help them understand Romanticism? Now, you might think that I'm wrong, that surely it's Delacroix's famous Liberty Leading the People, also in that same hall, that is the most often reproduced Delacroix in the textbooks. You could once see the Liberty painting on French money, for goodness sake. But when you actually look through the primary art history and art appreciation textbooks, what you find is wild. In Jansen, it's Sardanapalus. In Gardner, Sardanapalus. In art forms, Sardanapalus. Even in the more specialized textbooks devoted just to the 19th century, Petrochu, Sardanapalus, Eisenman, Sardanapalus, Rosen and Zerner, it's black and white, but it's Sardanapalus. You might have noticed from these slides that it's not always the only Delacroix reproduced, but it is by far the most often. So let me be clear. The painting that viewers in 1828 called dangerous, satanic, vile, and bizarre, the canvas that Delacroix was chastised for, was barely able to sell and essentially had to hide away. That has become the work we most often reproduce when teaching his oeuvre. At this point, I'd like to pause. And I'd like to ask a question that Charles Baudelaire, who first met the artist in the mid-1840s, asked when he wrote about the painter in 1863, quote, "What is Delacroix?" Was he, as his paintings seem to reveal, a sadist, or maybe just someone who dreamt of that kind of brutality? I've had students look at his work and tell me that if he was alive today, they think he'd be an incel, i.e. Some sort of internet troll who hates women on Reddit. But Baudelaire asking the question, a man of Delacroix's own time, this strikes me as significant in a way that's similar to the criticism of Sardanapalus. Baudelaire goes on to say a lot about Delacroix, most of it effusive praise. He calls him a great man at one point and a genius some 15 times total. But even amidst all the great manness and geniusness, Baudelaire seems occasionally troubled by the artist's personality when he's able to separate it from the beauty of his paintings, of course. He concedes that there's a certain brutality to the man. Quote, "There was much of the savage in Eugène Delacroix. That was the most precious part of his soul, the part devoted entirely to painting his dreams and to the cult of his art. There was in him much of the man of the world," end quote. I think this is exactly what I want to understand. How Delacroix was seen as both a man of the world, which I take to mean a man of his time, leading a public life, occupied with manly endeavors. And then he was also a savage, recognized by other men as such. For Baudelaire was not the only one to describe Delacroix this way in the 19th century. In 1856, Théophile Sylvestre likewise proclaimed, quote, "He is the man of our time." And only a little over 10 years later, Hippolyte Taine called him, quote, "the interpreter of our time." So for many of his contemporaries, he was typical, a man of the world, a man of our time. But there was also something deeply disturbing about what one commentator in 1826 called Delacroix's, quote, "harsh infelicities." In 1838, an anonymous writer in the Constitutionnel expressed concern over the painter's, quote, "excessive ardor." And Maxime de Camp thought that he, quote, "did not put up enough resistance to that inner wildness." Was this tension then between Delacroix's masculine savagery and his man of the worldness what made him so appealing but also appalling? Degrading, hostile, even outright abusive attitudes towards women were not uncommon in this part of the 19th century. But looking at what other men said about Delacroix shows that he, in some not insignificant way, exceeded the norms for men in his period. Again, I think it's Baudelaire who is perhaps most revealing in this regard, and I want to share a rather long quote now, and I'll give you the original French for those who prefer it. Quote, "He, Delacroix, considered woman an objet d'art, delightful and suitable for exciting the mind, but a disobedient and disturbing objet d'art. If permitted to cross the threshold of one's heart, she would ravenously devour one's time and strength." I remember once in a public place, I showed him the face of a woman of original beauty and melancholy nature. He was quite willing to savor her beauty, but as for the rest, he said to me with a quick laugh, "How do you expect a woman to be melancholy?" Implying no doubt that woman lacks an essential something to know the sentiment of melancholy. That is unfortunately a very uncomplimentary theory, and I should not like to preach insulting opinions about a sex that has so often demonstrated fervent virtues, end quote. So women for Delacroix are delightful and suitable for exciting the mind, but in his universe, they're not of much use beyond that. They don't have the mental or psychological capacity to feel deep sadness. And even Baudelaire, who I should point out was himself not any sort of staunch defender of women's rights, even he found Delacroix's theory of women injurieuses, which means everything from offensive to abusive and insulting. It can even mean outrageous. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Maybe it's unfair to only rely on his contemporaries like this, even if many of them were close to him, his bros, so to speak. I do think it makes sense to examine what we can that came straight from Delacroix, and he certainly left us enough to work with. In 1935, André Jubin published a 5-volume Correspondance Générale, much of which has been translated and added to since. In total, well over 1,500 letters survive from the artist. Add to this the journal he kept over several periods of his life. It runs to 3 volumes, some 1,400 pages, excluding the index. What can we glean from so many thousands of pages of documentary evidence? A lot, it turns out. We get to hear his views on art, his advice for his guy friends, but then also we hear a lot about his amorous escapades, and I'll show you now some of his drawings of the women that he was involved with. At first, he seems to have slept mostly with servants, a young English girl named Elizabeth Salter in 1817, then his sister's maid Caroline in 1819. The latter, he gets pregnant and then abandons. He described how he, quote, felt sorry for her while she was packing his suitcases and sobbing silently. He doesn't seem to have much sympathy for pregnant women in general. When his close friend Jean-Baptiste Pierret impregnates a young woman by accident that same year, Delacroix refers to her in letters as, quote, a certain big belly, and he encourages him to, quote, accept her as part of your lot. Then in his early 20s, he took up with his best friend's mistress while he was out of town. When the affair is discovered, it apparently strained their relationship for a time, shocking. And in the same period that he's working on the bark of Dante, journal entries attest to his various exploits, and I think sharing a few of them should suffice. Quote, I heard Lisette's voice in the distance. It has a sound that makes my heart beat faster. For this girl, who is not really pretty, has a beguiling way with her. I had stayed behind with her and allowed others to go on ahead. She kept telling me to stop, but very softly and sweetly. In the evening, we went to meet Lisette. I took advantage of being a little behind the others to kiss her. She struggled, and it vexed me because I could see she meant it seriously. I want to make her sorry for the way she's behaved. When I came home, I found Fanny sitting with that nice Madame F. I felt the delicious thrill run through me that heralds a good opportunity. When we reached the landing, I kissed her passionately. She made no attempt to push me away. Ought I to have gone further? This is not love. The girl herself does not really enter into it. It's a strange sensation. End quote. By the mid-1820s, Delacroix was mainly engaged in love affairs with married women, but mixed in with these long-term relationships, none of which resulted in marriage or children. He kept meticulous accounts of payments he made to models in addition to posing. He often used Italian slang to allude to these activities, most often some permutation of the verb chiavare. It means literally to nail in Italian, but the art historian Jack Spector has made the case that we should translate it as fucking, since that was how it was used colloquially in Delacroix's time. Hence, in May of 1823, he noted enjoying quote-unquote ravishing moments with his model Sidonie. Then in January, he described chiavatura with his Carina Emilia. On the 5th of March, dolce chiavatura. On the 31st, due chiavature, and this time he lists the payment, 5 francs. Then in May, he wrote of his model Laure, quote, she and la chiavatura 5 francs ieri anche un'altra con la nera, which translates to something like, she and the fucking 5 francs yesterday as well, another time with the black one. While Delacroix's behavior isn't all that unusual for a man of his class and occupation in this era, it may disturb some of you to hear what painting these women were posing for. Sidonie, the model Delacroix described enjoying ravishing moments with, posed for the dead mother in the foreground of the Chios. Emily Robert, whom he described screwing repeatedly for 5 francs, was his muse for the woman bound to the horse. Laure, we think, may have posed for the woman throwing herself at Sardanapalus' feet, and the woman referred to only as La Nera was likely a mixed-race model named Aspasie, who posed for this portrait study and seems to have morphed to become the male Académie in the center foreground. There's more, but maybe that's enough for now. I know I'm almost out of time. I'd like to close with something Delacroix said about a month before these back-to-back chiavatura sessions with Laure and Aspasie. On the 27th of April, Delacroix claimed there were, quote, no rules whatsoever for the greatest minds. Rules are only for people who merely have talent. After everything I've shared with you today, I can't help but wonder, is this true? Are there no rules for Delacroix because he was such a good painter? Do we forgive him everything, even when his contemporaries weren't willing to, because of how bold and fluid his color was? This talk was meant to get us all thinking about where we go from here. Now that you know all this, can you ever look at these paintings the same way? Or is it time for the tide to turn on even the most canonical artists? I've made my position clear. For me, The moment is now. It's time to uncover the ways that artworks have long reflected negative attitudes towards women. It's time to properly assess the fact that some of our most renowned painters exceeded even the harshest of dominant dialogues about gender in their respective eras. Most scholars have only ever speculated in passing that men like Delacroix may have been misogynists. I am seeking to redress this omission by fully exposing the masculinist narratives that have infused art history. I will admit, this is not easy work. It's hard to watch your idols fall from grace. But I think something has to change, and I hope some of you might agree. Thank you.